will be received into the divinity class after this session who has not attended the Irish class. And so Irish, under the aegis of the school and under the aegis of the Cudjach the Gaelic Olu, Irish schools were established throughout Ulster for teaching Irish, and this spread quite substantially. In 1836, the Presbyterian Church published the Psalms of David in Irish, and in this endeavour they were helped by the Reverend Norman MacLeod of St Columba's Church in Glasgow. He was known as Carriage na Gael, or the friend of the Gael, by his compatriots in Scotland. His son was a very beloved preacher by Queen Victoria, and he was also called Norman MacLeod. But the man himself, Norman MacLeod, who came over to Belfast to help out with preaching and so on, gave substantial help to the Northern Irish Presbyterian Church. By 1837, there were 74 schools in County Tyrone, 18 Christian Dáil, and the number grew by 300 by the year 1844. Many schools. And one of the most active encouragers of all this activity was the Reverend Dr. Henry Cook, whose statue, of course, stands near the Royal Belfast Academical Institution. And, of course, it's known colloquially as the Black Man. We all know the Black Man, although he's green. It's called the Black Man because his predecessor, Duke of Belfast, was black. He's smaller as well. And that statue is now, as well known, is now inside the City Hall. It's been demoted. So the Reverend Henry Cook took his place because he was very highly thought of indeed at the time, and very influential he was too. And at the General Synod of October 1832, he moved a motion, I quote, favouring the cultivation of the native tongue, unquote. And in 1836, when the Church of Scotland received the Synod of Ulster into its communion, Dr. Cook made the celebratory speech before the Assembly of Scots, in which he said, and I quote, "The Synod has lately enacted that all her students must study the Irish language." And then we hear, "Hear, hear," from the audience. "And I trust that you may yet be spared to see the day when, on visiting the Synod of Ulster, you may adopt the tongue of your native hills," that is Scottish Gaelic, "in addressing us, and not be necessitated to inquire from any of us, and Lauren to Gaelic." That means, do you speak Irish? And in the same speech, Cook made an appeal for Gaelic-speaking ministers to come to preach to the Irish speakers from Scotland. He said, "The Erse of your Highlands is so nearly akin to the Gaelic of Ireland that in a few months it would enable one or many of your preachers to proclaim the gospel to our countrymen. We will receive you into the heart of our humble hospitality, brotherly kindness and gratitude, and the Céad Míle Fáilte Róid with which Ireland will meet you will flow as warm from her heart as from the spirits of your Highland clansmen." So in his speech, he quite a lot of bits of Irish thrown in there. And his son-in-law, who wrote his biography, quotes this speech, and of course, what does he do? Cuts all these bits out, the Irish, you know. So this is what we have to deal with historically. People would like to change history around to suit their current viewpoints and so on. Now, I would like to say about the Ulster Gaelic Society that it was the first society ever that really wanted to promote Irish as a spoken language, not as an antiquarian or archaeological subject, which many organisations were founded for that purpose. And they used to do field trips and go around and look at archaeological sites and so on, etc. And they wrote about oceanic lore, etc. But the Ulster Gaelic Society was the first society to actually promote the spoken language. And the president of this society was the third Marquess of Downshire. The third Marquess of Downshire would be an archetypal Protestant. He, for example, was very prominent in the Orange Lodge. He was very influential. He was Church of Ireland, of course. But what he did do was he had a relationship with Dr. Henry Cook, And between the pair of them, they worked out a formula whereby they could cooperate together. And for the first time, Presbyterians came into the Orange Order, and they tended to act together afterwards and associate with each other much more and call themselves Protestants, like all together as one group. So this is the president of the Ulster Gaelic Society. Now, the chairman is Dr. James MacDonald, that I mentioned already, and the joint secretaries were Dr. Reuben John Bryce, who was president of Belfast Royal Academy, and Robert Shipboyne McAdam, that I've mentioned already too. He with his brother, owned the Soho Foundry, and he, on the side, as it were, did all these other things like edit the Ulster Journal of Archaeology, collect and commission manuscripts, collect folk tales, and so on. Now, this society and many subsequent individuals did much to foster the language and keep it to the fore at a time when the population were beginning to turn to English, a trend which accelerated after the Great Famine because it affected Irish speakers more than others. And I'd like to mention some of the Presbyterians who were active at this time, round about the beginning of and the middle of the 19th century. There was James McKnight, who was quite influential. He was a Presbyterian journalist and law reformer. He took part in the tenant right organisation, and he was described as the most influential layman in Ulster. He was born in Rathfriland, County Down, of a fluent Irish-speaking father, and when he was 26 he became editor of the Belfast Newsletter, and he was 20 years editor of the Belfast Newsletter, and later on then for another 20 years he was editor of the Londonderry Sentinel. And his frequent complaint in both these newspapers was that people who produced Irish books didn't send him a copy so that he could review them. And you could identify that he was writing because he always said, "Why don't they send me a copy of this so that I can review it?" But when he managed to get his hands on a copy, he would, on his own bat, review it. And so he gave quite a lot of publicity to the language over many years, and he reviewed as many books as he could possibly acquire. In 1835, he wrote an editorial comment welcoming the new weekly magazine called Ancient Ireland, produced by Philip Barron. He praised the intention to publish an Irish primer, a grammar, and an Irish dictionary, and Irish literature generally. In the same year, he reviewed a book of hymns in Irish produced by Miss Mary Jane Alexander. I often find it very difficult writing, and of course, much of what I'm saying is based on this book that I've written on the Presbyterians in Irish language, and I always try and find out where were the women in all of this activity, you know. So I was delighted to come across Mary Jane Alexander, who was the daughter of the Bishop of Meath. And if you look at the who's who, or the genealogical material, you'll find that single women are low down in the pecking order. And so she hardly gets a mention in these biographies, whereas I would consider her much more important than all the other people around her. And she produced a very nice little book of hymns in Irish, and she translated herself some of these, and got help from others to translate the other ones. The book is very, very scarce, and I could only find one in an American library on the internet. She's buried in Dublin, and he was delighted, James McKnight, to learn that this lady, who wouldn't even mention her name as author of the Book of Hymns, was the daughter of Nathaniel Alexander, of course, who was bishop also of St. George's Church. And he was responsible, you know, if anybody knows St. George's Church, Church of Ireland, and near the Albert Clock, they'll notice those great pillars in the front of the thing. Well, Nathaniel Alexander bought those from the Bishop of Bristol, or Bishop of Derry, and from Ballyscullion House. This is the 1830s, and had them shipped as one large structure, over Lough Neagh by boat and down the Lagan Canal and down through Belfast, and had them stuck on to what was basically like a barn before that, and now looks a very imposing structure with these great pillars in front of it, so on. So that is an extraordinary story, that. But now I wouldn't be complete unless I mentioned a very important person, that is Sir Samuel Ferguson, and he was the forerunner of what is known as the Celtic Revival, and he's been called the Homer of the Gael. And much of his poetry was translated from Irish, which he had learned himself in Belfast. And he was born of Presbyterian stock in Donegal in County Antrim, very strong Presbyterian area. And W.B. Yeats held him in very high esteem, and he used Ferguson as a model in his own poetry. His translation of the Irish of the story of the Battle of Moira has been published in recent years, as I mentioned, by my good friend Dr. Ian Adamson, who is the president of the Ullans Academy, and it's wonderful to see this again in print and being read. And then one could say that after 1828 and the formation of the Ulster Gaelic Society, and Sir Samuel Ferguson was one of these results, I like to think, there were many other results as well. There was the Reverend William Hamilton Drummond, who translated books of poetry in Irish into English. And they were very popular. When we're talking about publications in Irish, I think it's very important to mention that the very first printed book in Irish was a Presbyterian book. Now, that might startle some people, they might find that strange. But I mentioned before about the Reformation in Scotland, that it was in 1560, I think was the date of the Reformation in Scotland, and that John Knox was the instigator of that, and that he more or less converted the whole of Scotland from being Catholic to being Presbyterian in a year. Just he got the legislation passed and got it implemented, and it's quite an extraordinary event when you think that they're still working on that in Ireland. I think, since Luther put up his 95 postulates on the door at Wittenberg. And in England itself, it took right up until just a couple of years before that, 1588, or it was 2 years before 1560. It would be 1558, isn't it right? So that from then up until something like 80 years or 50 years it took to get the Reformation. Not until Queen Elizabeth I became regent, became queen, did the Reformation, was it complete in England. So it took a very long time. And it only took 1 year in Scotland, and it's taken forever in Ireland. I don't know when it'll ever come. But anyway, it's very interesting that the very first printed book was a translation by John Carswell of John Knox's Book of Common Order. The very first book. And if you pick it up, and I think I'll do that now, just a moment, and refer you directly to it. At that time, in 1567, written Irish and written Gaelic of Scotland was exactly the same. So that Carswell, in his preface, he addressed his book to Irish speakers and Gaelic speakers alike. For example, he said the following. I'll read this in Irish, and then I'll translate it. And if some of you may recognise this as being relatively modern. Is mór an látrum agus an iris a tauriú ar an gael, alaban agus éireann, har an chudgeile den dón, gan ar canuin scailge a chur a glóiriú, mar atá a ganuin agus jangi hen a gló a gachel a chinil rini elis dón. In other words, we Scottish and Irish Gaels have suffered very great distress and deficiency more than other parts of the world because our language has not been printed in contrast to other countries. And he's saying us, our, and all at the same time. And that even in 1725, when the Westminster Confession of Faith came out with the greater and the larger and shorter catechism, it was translated into Irish in 1725, as early as that. And so that was obviously considered to be very important at that time. Now, and then I have a long list, and I'll not go through every single one of them. A long list of books that are all basically Presbyterian publications in Irish, and I've mentioned some of them already. The Ulster Gaelic Society produced translation of Maria Edgeworth's stories, Forgive and Forget. The Psalms of David I mentioned. There were a number of books produced by the Ulster Gaelic Society, 4 or 5. A grammar. The grammar in Irish, called Casan na Gaeilge, or The Way of Irish, is quite interesting. It was produced by George Field, who was called Seoirse ó Mhaithe in Irish. And the full title is this: Casan na Gaeilge, an introduction to the Irish language, compiled at the request of the Irish teachers under the patronage of the General Assembly in Ireland, and dedicated to them as a tribute of esteem for their zeal in preserving and extending the knowledge of our beloved mother tongue by their friend and countryman S.O.M. That's Seoirse ó Mhaithe. And this was the third Irish grammar published in Belfast over a period of 6 years, and was the fifth Irish book to come out of Belfast since the Ulster Gaelic Society was formed in 1828. Now, that brings us more or less to relatively modern times, I think, now, because by the end of the 19th century, the Gaelic League was formed, 1893, and we find many Presbyterians enthusiastically taking part in the Gaelic revival. There was the Reverend George Buick, Cullybecky, County Antrim. He was vice president of the Belfast Gaelic League, and he was a member of the Royal Irish Academy and other things as well. There was the Reverend Richard Little and the Reverend Armour of Ballymoney. Sir John Byers had a great interest in the Irish language. He was a Presbyterian and professor of midwifery at Queen's University. And then Lord Aberdeen was appointed in 1906 as Viceroy of Ireland. He and his wife made a very big impression when they came. When they got off the boat in Dublin, the children were wearing linen suits and dresses, all with these flowery, Book of Kells inscriptions on them and so on. She was. In fact, they made fun of her. She was so Irish. She was more Irish than the Irish themselves. But she certainly did her best. And Lord Aberdeen, they were the very first Presbyterians to occupy a position of this kind in Ireland. And it was a kind of then started to come up to Belfast, and they were greeted by the Presbyterian churches up here and congregations, and made very welcome and so on. And but he himself, the Board of Governors or the Board of Education wouldn't allow Irish to be taught in the national schools, and he insisted. He says, if you don't allow this as has been agreed by the government, you're going to be all sacked. So they had to capitulate in the end, otherwise they'd all lose their jobs. So Lord Aberdeen, who usually played second fiddle to his wife, who was very active in everything, on this occasion he really proved himself very manly and virile, I think. Now, a thing did happen in 1915, which many people think damaged the cause of Irish language, and that was that the Ardèche, or the High Council, held annually of the organisation in 1915 in Dundalk, passed a resolution saying that Irish independence was an aim of the was an aim or an objective of the organisation. Now, this was very controversial, and it caused a lot of dissension and bad taste in the mouth. Nevertheless, following that time, there were still many people who kept up a great interest in the language and did much for it, including Sir William MacArthur, Rose Young, who was born at Galgorm Castle, who came from a very unionist family but produced books of Irish poetry in Irish. And she was a great friend of Douglas Hyde as well, who was a Church of Ireland, son of a Church of Ireland rector in Roscommon. Now, her brother, just to demonstrate, one of her brothers, just to demonstrate how unionist they were, he gave in Who's Who his hobbies as the Bee Specials and the Orange Order were his hobbies, 2 hobbies. So that places him somewhere. Now, and then there was Robert Lind, a prolific writer who reared his children in Irish, There was a gentleman called Hugh Macmillan, who was he had been left a substantial legacy by his mother, and he spent his life as a man of independent means, and he did an awful lot in publishing books, collecting stories, and all that kind of thing. And then I come to somebody that I personally knew, Sean Pasker, who was a Presbyterian civil servant and founded the Gaelic Fellowship in the YMCA, and I was lucky enough to go to some of his meetings because I was a student at Queen's. And I got to meet him and the people, some of the people in the classes and so on. And he taught classes, and he included songs and singing and dancing. And he was only 62 when he died in the Gaeltacht in 1965. I'd like to end up by talking about the present day, because I've been talking mostly historical. And just in summary, how do we stand at the present day? Well, now, most of the Gaelic speakers in Scotland are Presbyterian. And we had visits recently from a group of unaccompanied Gaelic psalm singers. And on at least one of these occasions, the Reverend Ian Paisley, or Lord Bandside as he's known now, was present and gave an address to the listeners in which he praised their music very highly. And I think we have a great change in attitudes everywhere, all around, towards these things. And as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, we know from the recent census that there are 167,000 people who know Irish, and that has gone up to 190,000. But among these are a number of people who are not Catholic by religion, about 12,000 or so, and of these, about 2,000 or so are Presbyterians. I could boast that I know most of them all, but I don't think I know every single one of them. I know quite a lot, but nevertheless, they are there, and the problem, like with Irish speakers in the north of Ireland, they tend to be scattered everywhere, all around the place, although people are getting together much more now recently than previously. And we have, for example, the Tor Lasso, which is the burning bush, is a Presbyterian meeting which takes place every month in Fitzroy, and it's very, very well attended. And I've just had a notice today that the Church of Ireland are starting a series of services the first Sunday in each month. So the Presbyterians are always that little step ahead, of everybody else. So I think that things can only go for the better from here onwards, and I thank you all very much. Yes, of course, yes. Now, Sir William MacArthur.
Sorry.
Yeah. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay.
Ruari, for a most stimulating lecture. It was wonderful as usual. You are the expert in the Irish language and Presbyterianism without equal. Could you tell us a wee bit more about Sir William MacArthur? He wrote to me when I was a schoolboy because I had written a piece in the Gryphon, the Bangor Grammar magazine, about the Red Dog of Glenure, and he disagreed with me totally and said, that I hadn't read his book on the subject in the Bangor Grammar School library. So I wrote back to him and said I was very, very sorry. But I'd learned all I did about the Red Dog of Glenure locally when I visited the Highlands with my grandfather at the age of 13. But you have some really good knowledge of that?
Yes, well, I knew it was quite a long story about how I got in contact with his sons. One of them was a member of Parliament for Perth, and the other one, Colin, was director of the Rank Foundation organisation. And they were both reared in Irish by the father, Sir William, who learned his Irish in Cloghaneely when he was very young, and he was inspired because he used to live in Bangor, where we all know Bangor very well. And the lighthouse in Bangor, is it Bangor or is it in further Donaghadee? Yes, Donaghadee Lighthouse. He went down out of curiosity, always asking questions, of course, and he discovered that the lighthouse keeper was an Irish speaker from Donegal, and he got very interested in the language. And then he went up purposely to Gortahort, Cloghaneely area, northwest Donegal, Gaeltacht, and he learnt the Irish perfectly. There's a recording of him made by Radio Éireann, the old Radio Éireann, and I've managed through the Sun to get this copied. And he's talking in Irish, and it's beautiful Irish from Clonakilty. But when he went as a medical student to Queen's University, he first thing he noticed was that there was no Irish taught, although it should have been. And it's quite a complicated history about that. John O'Donovan was professor of Irish at Queen's University, Belfast, but he never taught any Irish. We just talked about, as I say, about archaeology and all these things in the past. His father, actually a relation of his, the president of the college at the time, and the president of the college, when he heard that he was concerned about this, he says, why not start a branch for the students, a Common Gaelic, an Irish organisation, the Irish Society. And so he did that. And before long, and he made up a constitution. He says, anybody who talks about religion or politics will not be allowed in. So that would exclude me, I think. So he founded that, and then when he was quite young and qualified as a doctor, he fought in the First World War and was wounded in the stomach at the Somme, and came back home again. He joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, became Lieutenant Colonel, and in 1939 September, when the Second World War broke out, who was the head of the RAMC but this Irish-speaking Cloghaneely man, Sir William MacArthur? He wasn't Sir yet, but he was more of an academic, of course, than a man of activity. But nevertheless, he was responsible for all the engineering, all the doctors, the nurses, the ambulances, and everything that would be required in a world war. And he did this. There is a bit of movie-tone clip that I've seen, and he's there supervising the troops, orthopedic clinics, and he had all kinds of clinics opened and so on. And he appears himself. He looks very well. And but at the same time, it's like a double life. Then he retired from that. He became professor in the Tropical Medicine Institution in London, and he did a huge amount of research. He found that tinea solum was a cause of epilepsy. He wrote a lot about ancient plagues and about ancient diseases, and he's most noted for one thing, and that is he was the expert on the diseases during the Great Famine in Ireland. And largely this was due to the fact that in his studies he went to the old people in the area, and being medical and being interested in tropical diseases and so on, infectious diseases, he interviewed them and he discovered the names and terms for the different diseases and what they were, so he could distinguish between relapsing fever and yellow fever, etc., and so on. Fiauris Bui, Fiauris Jarek, Fiauris Du. And he was asked then to contribute to a book which was written at the centenary of that's 1945, and he provided a chapter on that, which has never been surpassed as a description of the diseases in the Irish famine. And he used to take advice from Irish scholars and so on about all the terminologies and everything else. He was also one of the most extraordinary lecturers ever. He signed up with the British Medical Journal Organisation to give lectures in London, and he gave a couple in Belfast. And Peter Froggatt, for example, told me that he was at one he gave in Belfast on the famine in Ireland, and he stood, with his hands in his pockets, and he, very kind of immobile, showed no emotion, and he just recited everything off from beginning to end for an hour, quoting dates, names, times, everything. And he said he'd never seen anybody who could lecture like Sir William MacArthur. And of course, he's the product of a very old school in Bangor, which I understand our president, Dr. Adamson, has also attended at one stage. Is that all right?
Yes, thank you. Ruari, when we hold our first Sir William MacArthur memorial lecture, I hope that you couldn't be persuaded to give that same lecture. Certainly, he did stimulate my interest in, well, I'd been back from the Highlands where my great-granny came from Isla, but he stimulated a lot of interest in me at that time. And at the time I attended Bangor Grammar School, there wasn't a great deal of interest in some of these fields of study, but thank you very much for your lecture. And I do hope that you'll continue to give this lecture in other occasions and in other venues, because it is absolutely unique. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that. Thank you. Just as one word about, he had one of his great interests was the connection with Scotland, and he believed that his family were one of the MacGregors of Scotland, and he did a detailed study of the background to the murder, what was the Appin murder. Yes. And in the course of that, he wrote a whole book on it, of course. And in the course of that, he explained, everybody knows the story of Kidnap, Robert Louis Stevenson, and so on. And Alan Breck was supposed to have committed this murder, but he puts the whole thing into context. He puts the story of that kidnapped and what went on there, and the court cases and everything else. He went through it all very, very thoroughly and came to the conclusion that the person who carried out the murder actually escaped and went to France, and it wasn't any of the local people at all.